Excuse me for a minute. I just need to finish something, so I'm going to go off screen for a little bit.
Yeah.
And actually, there was one question I wanted to ask you after yesterday, because I didn't quite get my head around it.
Yeah.
The different levels of inspections of cargo, from kind of complete to inspection of cargo to sort of more lax ones.
You
So
mean
I guess
insurance?
what determines that?
For insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically.
For insurance and customs inspections, that.
Okay, but they're completely different things.
Mm-hmm.
So with customs inspections, the global guideline is not more than 3% of cargoes imported should have an intrusive examination. So the World Customs Organization guidelines are basically that not more than 3% of cargo should have intrusive examination.
Mm-hmm.
Not more than 17% should have a document examination. 80% should have no checks. They should arrive, they should be cleared online, and they should be released and go straight through. So those are the WCO guidelines. And, implemented in different countries in different ways. But globally, most countries are, some countries are nowhere near that. But globally, things are changing. I can remember a couple of years ago, I was mentoring the customs commissioner in Nigeria on a small program just to give some mentoring. And I knew the answer to the question I was going to ask him. So I said to him, Commissioner, of all the cargoes arriving in Nigeria, how many have an intrusive examination? I knew the answer. And he said to me, John, that's an easy question. And I said, well, Commissioner, tell me how many, what portion of cargoes are examined when they arrive at Lagos port in Nigeria and the other ports? And he said, very easy question. It's 100%. We check everything. And I said to him, well, you appreciate that's very much against World Customs Organization guidelines. And he came out with the most incredible comment. He looked at me in the face and he said, John, one thing you have to remember, and he pointed to himself and he said, all of us Nigerians, we all cheat the system. That's why we examine everything. And that's what he said. Now, that's kind of one extreme, if you like. And I have to say, in the last couple of years, in Nigeria, they have a very strict customs regime. They've made huge improvements in trade facilitation. But that's what the guideline is. Not more than 3% should have an intrusive examination. And that 3%, they could be if customs say we are going to do an examination, it should be for one of two reasons only. One reason is if they have specific intelligence that there's something not quite right. And it could be because they query the commodity code that's being used. It could be because it doesn't look like the normal type of business the consignor and consignee usually do. It could be because it's an unusual import for the country concerned. It could be because the value seems far too low, the value declared. So, that would be specific intelligence. And that would generally be triggered by the customs management system. The other reason is that every customs authority is allowed to check at random. So they could say, okay, one every 5,000 imports, we're going to do an intrusive examination. That's very usual as well, to do random checks. But those are the only two circumstances where they should be doing intrusive examinations. If there's specific intelligence, which is the terminology, or if it's a random check. That's a really long answer to your question, Polina, but does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, John. I just got a little confused by it, but yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it is confusing. It is confusing. But, as I say, with all these things, customs authorities in different countries implement in different ways. But that's why we have the trade facilitation agreement that we spoke about yesterday, because the whole idea of that would be that every single country operates in the same way and shares information with each other. So, I think, as the trade facilitation agreement came into force in 2017, implementation is slow. But, over the years since then, there's been a real, a gradual, but a real improvement in customs performance. And that is measured every year by the World Bank. There's an index that they do. I think now they do it every 2 years. It used to be every year. So, the agreement is having impact, but in many countries, it's kind of, it's slow implementation.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, so it's now 1:00. We don't have everyone, but I know that some people are unable to attend. So with your permission, I would like to record the session again so we can share it with those who are unable to make it. So I'm going to start the recording now. Is everyone happy with that? You're okay for me to record? Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay. We all set.
All right. So welcome to part 4. I've just asked a question about something that was not clear to me. So if anything is unclear to you, please ask, whether it's some acronym or whether it's a particular rule. Just ask, or you can also post your questions in the chat and we will get them asked in the session. I will provide you with a recording of the previous session and also with the training slides for yesterday and today after this session. All right, and now I will let John take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Polina, and great to see you all again. Welcome to today's session. So before we start today's session, any questions at all on what we covered yesterday or last week? Any comments on that? Any worries about it? There'll be time for Q&A at the end, but anything that you want to ask now, please feel free to do so.
I just had one, mostly going back to the first session.
Yeah.
Around the official certificate of origin.
Yeah.
Is the provenance of that down to national regulations? Because I've seen sort of some traders in the past have come to me and said, can I do it? And I've not normally directed them back to the local Chamber of Commerce. Is that kind of the normal route for a certificate of origin for, say, for a primary mineral that's being mined somewhere?
Yeah, it is. In most countries, it will be the Chamber of Commerce that certifies certificates of origin. John, thank you for asking. It's a really good point. There's, so normally the situation is, because remember, it's not the Chamber of Commerce, it's the exporter who is declaring origin. All the Chamber of Commerce will do is put a rubber stamp on it and say, well, we don't really know, but we think they're telling the truth. That's all the certification is. Chambers of Commerce, I can remember when I started my career, one of the organizations I worked for was a shipping agent, a forwarding agent. And one of my jobs, didn't get the great jobs when I first started as a graduate trainee. One of my jobs was every afternoon, towards the end of the day, we used to raise documentation for our clients. And at the end of each day, I would get all the certificates of origin together for our various clients that we'd generated for them that day, and I'd take them to the Chamber of Commerce. And they'd say to me, okay, come back at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you'll get the certified copies. And we were just one organisation, and a fairly small organisation. And every day we were taking in probably about 25, 30 certificates of origin for certification. They were always ready 9 o'clock the next morning. And when I got to know the people at the Chamber of Commerce a little bit, I got brave enough to say to them, how can you do that? I bring the documents in. We're just one company doing it. Other companies are doing it as well. We're bringing the documents in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 9 o'clock the next morning, I collect them and they're all certified. How can you check the origins that quickly? And the guy just burst out laughing. And he said, we don't check the origin. How can we? He said, there's no way we can do that. All we're doing is certifying what the exporter has said. And that certification is purely saying we believe it to be correct, but we're not actually saying it is correct, because the exporter may not be telling the truth. And I suddenly realized that certification actually means nothing whatsoever. And there's a lot of work being done at the moment, led by the World Trade Organization, and it's all about cutting out the need for certification. of things like certificates of origin, because, you know, the certification means nothing. The important thing is that the exporter or the manufacturer, if it's manufactured goods, in other words, the body nearest the product, they're the ones who are declaring the origin. Now, they're declaring the origin either for non-preference reasons or for preference reasons. But it is that party that's declaring the origin. All the Chamber of Commerce are doing is putting a rubber stamp on it. So, John, to go back directly to your question, in most countries, it will be a Chamber of Commerce that does that. In some countries now, they've cut out the need for chambers of commerce intervention because, you know, frankly, it's money for nothing. The chambers of commerce charge for it, but there's no value add. All they're doing is putting a rubber stamp on it, but they're not checking anything. They can't possibly do that. So in most countries, currently, it is the Chambers of Commerce that will do that. In some countries, it will be the customs authorities. In other countries, it will be other regulatory authorities that have the job of doing it. But you're absolutely right. The common thing, the most common thing, is actually Chambers of Commerce at the moment. But, you know, in the coming years, I think we're going to see a big change to that. Because, you know, frankly, the certification means nothing. What really matters is that the exporter has done their research before they give a declaration of origin. Now, if it's a mineral that's come straight from a mine, there's not going to be any question about the origin. You know, it shouldn't be controversial in any way whatsoever. But the thing you have to remember, and again, you know, we touched on this on Monday, is that as soon as if you then take that mineral and it goes to another country, even if you carry out the smallest activity on it, you know, a very small activity. You know, you guys are the experts on minerals, I'm not. But, you know, if you did a small activity on it, a small process, that can change the origin. It may not, but it may change the origin. Every time you have to check the rules of origin for the countries concerned against the commodity code for that mineral. And that's a check that has to be done every single time. Because even the smallest action, the smallest process may change the origin. It may not, but it may change the origin. John, does that answer that okay?
Yes, thank you. On that one about people doing small changes, I think some of the big companies make a lot of money with blending operations in Taiwan for that very reason, to feed into China post-blending. Yeah.
And, you know, depending on the rules of origin, it can just be a very, very minor process that's taking place, and that can change the origin. It may not, but it may do. And, you know, obviously, if it does change the origin, and then there can be an advantage of a free trade agreement or putting the goods into free circulation, duty-free, then clearly there's a benefit in doing that, absolutely. Great, thanks for that, John. Good point. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so let me now share my screen. Oh, by the way, just to say, we will do the normal thing. We'll break at round about 2:30 UK time, which is UTC +1. Then we'll reconvene half an hour later. And as I mentioned yesterday, I'm trying to allow, and probably will be able to allow, plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I want to allow at least half an hour for Q&A, as this is the last session. So my aim is that, you know, I will kind of finish talking round about 4 o'clock or before 4 o'clock UK time. Hopefully it'll be before 4 o'clock, and then we can go into Q&A on everything that we've covered during the 4 sessions. So that's the plan. Let me share my screen. Okay, can I just check if someone could tell me if you can see the full screen?
I can see it, yes.
Brilliant.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Paulina. So today we're talking money. We're going to talk about export credit control, methods of payment and the options available, some of the finance options, and then a bit of a focus on the end about letters of credit, because there's lots and lots of misunderstanding on LCs, on letters of credit. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's all about money. And let's start off with a bit of a generalization, but some good news. Well, I think it's good news. And that is that actually, even though in international trade, getting paid can be more complicated than domestic trade, one of the realities is we can actually make it safer than domestic trade. We can make getting the payment or securing the payment more safely than we can with domestic trade. And the reason I say that, and you'll see this as we go through the various methods of payment a bit later on, but the reason I say that is because a key thing to remember as we talk about this today is that in international trade, the documents represent the goods. Without the documents, the buyer, the importer, cannot take delivery of the goods. So by having control of the documents, whether the seller has control or the buyer has control, by having control of the documents, we've got control of the goods. And as you'll see later on, we can use that as leverage to get paid. And jumping ahead to what I'm going to be talking about later, what you are going to see is that many, or in fact most, of the methods of getting payment in international trade are based on exchanging the documents for the payment. And that protects both parties, and we'll look at how that works a bit later on. But a key starting point is export credit control. It's the payment thing. So if you think right back to day one, when we looked at this graphic, we've got the contracting at the top. We've got the physical movement of the goods. We've got the documentation. And, we've covered those three elements in previous sessions. This session, we're going to talk about payment. And if we talk about, a simple transaction, you've got a buyer and a seller, an importer and an exporter. The importer has got to pay the exporter, in other words, the buyer's got to pay the seller. And they may pay them directly, probably through something like a bank transfer, but most likely they're going to pay them through the banking, they're going to pay them through the banking system. And we'll look at how that works a bit later on. So before we can really talk about the methods of payment, we've got to think about what is the export credit risk. And this is often missed out. I can remember a couple of years ago working in East Africa, and I was training exporters in Zambia, the copper exporters, the cobalt exporters in that region, and not just mineral exporters, but other products as well. And it was really interesting when this was actually on behalf of the European Union, and when we put the training program together, as I always do, I said to the EU, okay, what do you see as the content? What should the content be? And they had, most of it, they was very, very reasonable. Contracting had to be there, shipping and logistics had to be there, insurance had to be there, customs compliance had to be there, rules of origin had to be there. They left out export credit control. And I said to them, don't you want me to cover export credit control and getting paid so that the mineral exporters and all the other exporters in the region, in Zambia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Malawi, so that they can secure their payments. And the EU kind of said, I was in Lusaka at the time in Zambia, and the EU delegation there said, oh yes, that's a good idea. And I don't really get shocked by these things anymore, but I was a bit surprised, because what can be more important from a seller's perspective than getting paid? It's crucial. Why sell your copper if you're not going to get paid for it? There's no point. Now, from an exporter's point of view, before they can work out the important things, and there are two things the exporter's got to work out. And again, we'll expand on this later on. But the exporter's got to consider for every transaction what's going to be the method of payment and what's going to be the term of payment. And they're two different things. The method of payment is, how am I going to get paid? Is it going to be collection, letter of credit, open account? How am I going to get paid? That's the method of payment. The term of payment is, when am I going to get paid? Am I going to give the buyer credit, or do I want the payment straight away? In international trade, if it's payment straight away, we call it payment at sight. And there's a traditional reason for that, because traditionally it means on sight of the documents. when the documents have been cited, payment becomes due. That's the traditional reason for doing that. So anyway, what it really means nowadays, if an exporter says, I want cite payment, it means that's immediate payment. Generally, it doesn't have to be. Generally, that can be linked with the Incoterm, and it would generally be when the goods are legally delivered. So with most Incoterms, that's going to be on dispatch of the goods. But, you know, in international trade, most buyers are going to ask for credit. You know, the export cycle, the sales cycle, can be a long cycle. The material's got to be shipped before the buyer they've got to receive it, the buyer's got to receive it, they've got to customs clear it before they get value. So the sales cycle can be quite long. Because of that, most sensible buyers are going to ask for credit. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and that becomes the term of payment. So there's going to be a method of payment. How is the exporter going to get paid? And there's going to be a term of payment. When is the exporter going to get paid? And the exporter, the seller, excuse me, can't make decisions on that until they've assessed the risk. Excuse me. And what I always say to exporting companies is the most important department in your company is the Export Credit Control Department. That's the most important department, Export Credit Control. So they've got to assess the risk. And there are several risks they've got to think about. So from a seller's point of view, now, if you're selling either domestically or internationally, there's always going to be a commercial risk. And the commercial risk is defined as a risk of non-payment within the buyer's control, or risk of non-payment due to an activity by the buyer. So the commercial risk is things like the buyer just decides they're not going to pay, or they've got a cash flow problem, or they go bankrupt, or it's a de-Incoterm and they don't like the product when they receive it. There can be loads of reasons. But the commercial risk is a risk within the control of the buyer. And whether you trade domestically or internationally, there will always be a commercial risk that the buyer won't pay. So the seller has got to assess the commercial risk of their customer. Are they credit worthy? They've got to do that. And they've got to do that whether it's domestic trade or whether it's international trade. Now, if it's an international trade, there's a bundle of other risks they have to think about. The banking risk, because generally in international trade, the payment will be affected by two banks, a bank in the seller's country and a bank in the buyer's country. The bank in the buyer's country will transfer the money to a bank in the seller's country. So there are going to be two banks involved in the transaction. And the seller has got to assess the banking risk. I'm selling to Nigeria. What are the banks like in Nigeria when they transfer the money? Are they going to do it on time? What happens if they're short of foreign exchange? Those are the kind of things I have to think about. So there's going to be a banking risk that has to be assessed. There's going to be a political or a sovereign risk. You know, countries, and we've seen so much of that this year, countries have political arguments, if you like, with each other. You know, they have disagreements, and they may not just be trade disagreements, but they may have disagreements that have an effect on their trading capabilities. So there are lots of things that can happen, and these are outside the control of the buyer. There may be a civil war. There may be, two governments have a disagreement about something. There could be unexpected non-tariff barriers put in place, loads of things that can happen. And that could impact on the buyer's ability to pay. It may be the buyer will go to their central bank and say, okay, please transfer $100,000 to the exporter in the Netherlands. And the central bank will say, really sorry, we can't do that. At the moment, there's a block on transferring money to the Netherlands. There's a bit of a diplomatic dispute going on. We are not allowed to transfer any money to the Netherlands. Or more likely, they may say, really sorry, we can't do it this week. There's no foreign exchange. We've got no euros. Talk to us again next week. There may be some euros available. So there are lots of risks, political and sovereign risks, that may happen. There are also country risks, things like earthquakes, storms, natural disasters that can affect any country. The banks may not open because of something like that. If the banks don't open, how can they transfer the money? And adding to all of that, then of course you have got the transit risk that the goods will get lost, broken, stolen, pilfered during the transit of the goods. Now, that only becomes a payment risk when the de-Incoterm's being used. But if a de-Incoterm's being used, then that's something else that you have to think about. Because, if you've never legally delivered the goods, you will never be entitled to get paid if you're the seller. So that's the key there. And if we drill down a bit more, these are the kind of things that we're talking about. So with commercial risk, remember the key thing is that is generally within the control of the customer. And remember, there's always a commercial risk whether you're trading domestically or internationally. And examples of that, the customer, the buyer, is insolvent. If they've got no money, there's no point in suing them because they've got no money. Or maybe it's a de-Incoterm, you're selling under a de-Incoterm and they don't accept the goods when they arrive. Or maybe you're selling under a de-Incoterm and they do accept the goods, but they still don't pay you for them. Those are kind of standard customer or commercial risks. Or maybe they're simply having a short-term cash flow problem. And then the country political sovereign risks, exchange control restrictions. I think I mentioned the other day that, the countries that everyone's getting really excited about now are the emerging economies. I think we spoke about this a little bit the other day, that many, many markets are deemed to be saturated. But the emerging markets, people are getting really excited about them. It was the mint countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, what's the T? Thailand, I think it was. But, we keep on seeing these different acronyms, these different groupings. But, markets are emerging and people are getting really excited about the new emerging markets. But one of the features of them is that they will be investing heavily in infrastructure. Last week, I used the example of Nigeria, completely new port being built at Lekki, a new airport being built at Lekki, costing billions and billions and billions of dollars, euros and pounds. They're going to be short of foreign exchange because of that. But that's because their economy is growing exponentially. So we have to think about exchange control restrictions. Now we can, as a seller, as an exporter, we can work with that by having, something like a letter of credit as the payment methodology. But we need to know if those are in place before we can decide on the payment method. So there may be exchange control restrictions. Collapse of the banking system. Now, isn't it interesting? Let's think back to the banking crisis of 2008, the global crisis. Now, interestingly, before 2008, when I was teaching about export payments, export finance, trade finance, then of course I would warn exporters and say to them, be careful. When you're trading with countries like Venezuela, Mexico, Cambodia, Nigeria, the banking system could collapse. So be really careful. Make sure you have confirmed letters of credit, things like that. Then the global financial crisis happened. And of course, the whole environment changed because, frankly, if you look at it, it wasn't Nigerian banks collapsing. It wasn't Indonesian banks. It wasn't Mexican banks. It wasn't Venezuelan banks. It was French banks. It was US banks. It was English banks. So it was the OECD countries whose banks were failing. And, a lot of stories have come out of that now. That's 2008. It was a long time ago, but it takes time for them to sift through. And I'm not going to mention names here, but I was talking to someone last year, Earlier this year, in fact. And they were the chief executive of one of the major UK banks that nearly collapsed. He's retired now. But it was one of the major banks that nearly collapsed. And he told me the story. He said, during the crisis, while it was going on, he said on one occasion, one morning, he got his reports in from his colleagues, and he could see the situation was really, really dire. And he realized that something had to be done very, very quickly. And, he was the chief executive of a very big bank in the UK, a very important bank. And he realized he needed to speak to the Prime Minister. And, you can't just dial a phone number and get through to the Prime Minister. So, he went through the process. And everyone he spoke to, all the gatekeepers of the Prime Minister, they could tell this was something really serious. So eventually, they did actually put him through to the Prime Minister. And what he said to me was, and I said to the Prime Minister straight away, unless the Bank of England steps in today, and it needs to be today, this bank will go bankrupt. We will run out of money. Now, if a UK bank ran out of money, there would be, you can just imagine the chaos. There'd be a run on all of the banks that would spread throughout Europe. We were members of the European Union at the time. That would have, there would have been a contagion effect all over Europe. So the Bank of England did step in, and that bank didn't collapse, fortunately. But it just shows how near things were back in 2008. And the key thing here is that, collapse the banking system, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bank in an emerging market. It could be a bank in any country. Now, having said that, since 2008, and because of 2008, banks are actually stronger now than ever before. New rules have come in, new international rules called the Basel II rules. They've come in, and now banks are much, much stronger than they were before. So could it happen again? I'm a real believer in never say never, but it's more unlikely than ever that there would be a collapse of the banking system. But nevertheless, it is a risk that has to be considered. Then we get things like internal conflicts, civil unrest. Society now, that can happen in any country. There are triggers, and the world seems a very, very fragile place at the moment in many, many countries. Things seem to be very, very much on the edge, and you can get situations in any country where, and it may just last a day or 2 days, when you've got civil unrest, you've got internal conflict, the banks don't open during that period because it's dangerous for them to open. So they don't open, they can't make any transfers, and that can delay payment. Government interventions, political events, as I said, there may be arguments between two countries. We're going to cut you off the SWIFT system. That's a threat that's, been hanging over Russia in the last few years, that they will be disconnected from SWIFT. SWIFT being the system the banks use to move money around the world. So government intervention due to political events, and then trade and licensing restrictions, sanctions. We've seen that again in Eastern Europe with the Russia situation. Trade and licensing restrictions. Well, with the USA tariffs, we've seen issues about that as well. So there are loads of things that can affect payment. Some of them are within the control of the buyer, and those are the commercial or customer risks, but many of them aren't. And those are the country, political, or sovereign risks. Okay, let me pause there. Any questions so far? Or comments? Okay. So, how would the seller choose the method of payment? And ideally, it's going to be by negotiation between seller and buyer, but the seller's the one who's the exporter, they're the one who's or the trader, they're the one who's going to need to get paid. So generally it is the seller that's going to have primacy on choosing the method and the term of payment. Just to remind you, the method of payment is the how. how is payment going to take place? The term of payment is the when. When is payment going to take place? So what is the seller going to think about? And the first and most important aspect is minimizing the credit risk. Looking at all these things and all the rest of them, these are just some examples. So considering all of these things and thinking, okay, I've done my assessment of the customer commercial risk. I've also assessed the country political sovereign risk, and this is the result I've come to. And there's a golden rule that I always mention in companies, and that is that no one should outrank or countermand the export credit controller once they've come to a decision. Because export credit control is a science. It's not an art, it's a science. And that function of export credit control, minimizing the credit risk, of course, is crucial. You know, credit controllers have a saying, which makes a lot of sense. And that saying is, a sale is not a sale until it's been paid for. And that, I think, makes a lot of sense. So the seller's main criteria is going to be minimizing the credit risk. Then they're going to look at their own need for funds. If they're cash strapped, you know, if they're in a difficult cash situation, then there is no way they should be giving credit. You know, a buyer, if I'm the buyer, I'm going to ask for credit. You know, I would say to the seller, okay, I want 90 days credit. But if the seller is cash strapped, then they would probably say to me, really sorry, we're not going to give that to you. It's got to be payment at sight. And, you know, this can become a really big issue. I've seen this so often, where a buyer puts pressure on a seller saying, I want credit, give me 30 days, 60 days. And the buyer almost panics, the seller almost panics. They want to keep the sale. So they say, okay, we'll give you 30 days credit. And they can't really afford to give that credit. And they've got to wait 30 days for payment. And while they're waiting, they run out of money, they get cash strapped, they're sued, they go out of business. It happens so often, you know, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it happens a lot. It really does happen a lot. So that's really important. Exporters need to look at their own need for funds before agreeing a payment term. Never give credit if you can't afford to. Okay, now they may be able to use methodologies like discounting with a bank. We'll talk more about that later on. So there are kind of compromises that sellers can do. You know, they may be able to say to a bank, okay, we need the money straight away, but we will accept less than the contract value, but we want it now. And that's called discounting. So they may be able to discount under certain circumstances. The other thing that it's always good to do is look at usual terms for sales to the importing country. A seller doesn't have to do what the usual terms are, but it gives an idea of what most people are doing, and it does give an idea of the country risk. For example, anyone selling to Indonesia, to Venezuela, to Nigeria, to Mozambique is going to ask for a confirmed letter of credit. Anyone selling to Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, European Union is probably going to be happy with open accounts as long as the credit checks are okay. So when we talk about the usual terms for sales to the importing country, you don't have to follow those, but they just give an idea of what most people do. What are competitors offering? Because, you know, if you're an exporter, there will be competitors. So what are most competitors offering? You look at what the competition are doing. Now, you know, you don't have to do what competitors are doing. Maybe they're giving open accounts at 90 days. Maybe you can't afford to do that. So it'd be crazy to follow what they're doing. But it's always good to know what the competition is doing. And if you can offer something better than competitors are offering, that's great. You may not be able to, to protect your own interests, but maybe you can do something better. Maybe competitors are offering open account at 30 days, and you may think, okay, we've dealt with that buyer for years now. We're doing all right for cash at the moment, so let's offer them 60 days or 90 days. Then we'll get the business. So what competitors are offering, that can, help in making the decision as well. And of course, the effect of bank charges. Of course, in international trade, you will be using banks to move the money from the buyer to the seller. And of course, there is a cost which will be captured within that. But remember, the party that pays the bank charges, that will be decided as at contract stage. The normal thing is that in most cases, the seller will pay the bank charges in their country and the buyer will pay bank charges in their country. But it could be something different's been negotiated. Maybe in the contract it says the buyer pays all the bank charges or the seller pays all the bank charges. So that will always be a matter of negotiation at the time of contracting. And frankly, in most cases, bank charges aren't, they're not going to be a very, very big element of the contract price. But the big thing is, in terms of selecting the correct method and term of payment, the most important takeaway there is the seller, the exporter, must consider all the risks, both the commercial risk and all the country, political and sovereign risks as well. If the seller only considers the commercial risk, they could be making a very, very big mistake in the payment method. If they only consider the political sovereign country risk, they may be making a very big mistake in deciding on the payment method. So this is the important takeaway. The export credit controller has got to consider all the risks before they can come at a scientific method of payment and term of payment for each transaction. Okay, any questions so far, please? Any comments? Okay. So what have we got in relation to methods of payment? Now, as you can see there's a whole list. Letters of credit I'm going to cover right at the end. Okay, we're going to leave those. Those are the letter of credit is, they can be quite complicated, but not nearly as complicated as most people think. They can be a bit complex. But what we're going to come back to later on is the fact that the letter of credit is actually the only payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. No other payment method does that. So we'll leave that till the end. So let's have a look at the extremes first. And the extremes are the first and the last method of payment that you can see on that list. Oh, sorry, I did that too quickly. So the two extremes are cash in advance and open account, payment in advance. So payment in advance, the exporter getting paid in advance, that sounds great, doesn't it, from the exporter's perspective? But it makes the buyer very, very vulnerable. If I'm the buyer and I have to pay in advance, how do I know that the goods are going to be shipped, that they're going to be the right goods, the right documents will be generated, and I will get the documents? How do I know? I'm taking a huge risk if I pay in advance. And in some countries where buyers are located, governments will not allow payment in advance because of the vulnerability to the buyer. Governments in many countries are also worried that payment in advance may be linked to money laundering. That's another concern that governments have. So payment in advance, cash in advance sounds great, but it's not good for the buyer. And it's not good for a long-time business relationship. So the kind of situation where payment in advance may be used is a situation where I'm the seller and you contact me and you say, John, I need 20 kilos of this very special metal from you. I know you've got some. I need to buy it from you. It's a real emergency. I need you to get it on an airplane tomorrow. And I would say to you, look, I'd love to help you, but we've never traded with you before. We don't know you. There are risks involved. You want it really quickly. So for that reason, we will do it, but we want payment in advance. And if I'm desperate, if the buyer is desperate, they may say, OK, we will pay you in advance. We'll do a transfer today. And then the buyer will just hope the goods are going to be shipped, the right documents will be generated. It's a risk. It is a risk. But that's the kind of situation where cash in advance would be used. When it's a very, very high risk situation from the seller's point of view, they don't know the buyer. Maybe the country risk is high as well. The buyer says they want it straight away. There's no trading relationship. The seller may say, OK, pay us in advance and we'll ship the goods to you. OK, we'll go ahead. So that's payment in advance. It's not good for a long-term business relationship. Now, the opposite to that, the most low risk situation is open account. And if I'm the seller, that means I'm selling to a low risk customer in a low risk country. OK, so maybe I'm in the UK, I'm selling to someone in France, I've traded with them for the last 5 years, they've always paid on time. France, well, actually, with what's going on in France at the moment, maybe I shouldn't say this, let's go to Germany instead. Selling to Germany. Germany is a low country risk. I've traded with a customer in Germany for a long time. They always pay on time. So it's a low risk transaction. I may say, OK, we'll trade with you on open account. We'll give you 30 days. And the seller relies on the buyer to pay them on time. Very often with open account, it may be supported by credit risk insurance. And credit risk insurance, just like we can insure the goods if they get damaged, broken or stolen, we can also insure against the risk of not getting paid. And that's called credit risk insurance. So open account can leave the seller vulnerable. So very often with open account, the seller will have a credit risk insurance policy. So if the buyer doesn't pay, then the seller can get payment under their credit risk insurance policy. So those are the two extremes. Cash in advance for the most high risk environments. Open account for the most low risk environments. Those are the two extremes. Any questions on those so far before we start looking at the other ones? Okay, so all the other payment methods that you can see there on the screen are based on the principle of documentary exchange. And that principle is very, very straightforward. In international trade, the documents represent the goods. So the goods get shipped and the seller, the exporter, generates the documentation, sometimes in conjunction with third parties, possibly like the carrier or a chamber of commerce. But basically, the seller is in control of the documents. Invoices, packing lists, bills of lading, certificates of origin, analysis certificates, inspection certificates. The seller is in control of the documents. And the principle of documentary exchange is very straightforward. The seller says to the buyer, OK, I will release the documents to you once you've paid me, or once I've secured your payment. So I've got the documents. You as the buyer, you've got the money. You give me the money and I'll give you the documents. And with those documents, you can customs clear and take delivery of the goods. And that's what the principle of documentary exchange is. It's an exchange of documents for payment. And apart from cash in advance and open account, all the other methods of payment you can see on the screen, all of those are based on the principle of documentary exchange. And the simplest way of doing that is cash against documents or payment against documents. Probably we're not going to use banknotes, but payment against documents, or it may even be banknotes. And the way that works is exactly as it sounds. So I'm sitting here in the UK and I'm selling to a buyer in India, and we agree on cash against documents. So I ship the goods to India, I generate the documentation, invoices, packing lists, certificate of origin, bills of lading, analysis certificate. I've got all the documents. And I make an agreement with the buyer in India. OK, I've got the documents, you've got the money, where do we do the exchange? And we may decide to do the exchange in Dubai. We meet up in Dubai. The buyer from India has got the money, cash, or more likely, we don't really want to deal in cash because that can get messy, more likely an official bank draft, something like that. I, as the seller, have the documents. The buyer hands me the bank draft and I hand over the documents. In its simplest form, that is cash against documents. Now, do we really want to do that? Do we really want to go to the trouble of having to meet somewhere to do that exchange? There could be security issues, there could be reliability issues. Do we really want to do that? Probably not. So probably what we're going to do is use the banking system to exchange the documents for the money. And then we change it. It's no longer cash against documents. It becomes a bank collection. And with the bank collection, what I'm going to do, I'm the seller in the UK. I'm selling to a buyer in India. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ship the goods to India. Once the goods have been shipped, I'm going to get all the documents together, invoices, packing lists, bills of lading, certificates of origin, analysis documents, whatever they may be. I'm going to get all the documents together. I'm going to hand the documents to my bank, and I'm going to say to my bank in London, please collect payment from my customer in India, and I'll give them the details of my customer. My bank in London will then send the documents to their correspondent bank in India. You know, all the banks have relationships with other banks in different countries. So my bank in London will send all the documents to the bank in India with whom my bank in London has a relationship. The bank in India will then contact my customer and say to them, come and take up the documents. My customer will go to the bank in India and say, okay, here are my banking details. You can now debit my account. The bank in India will debit the account of the buyer. And once they've debited the account of the buyer, they will release the documents to them. The bank in India will then transfer the money to my bank in London, and my bank in London will put the money in my account. And that's a bank collection, sometimes called a documentary collection. Now, with a documentary collection, a bank collection, that would only be used in kind of medium to low risk environments. You wouldn't use that in a high risk environment because there are two issues with bank collections. One of them is a vulnerability for the seller, and one of them is a vulnerability for the buyer. So vulnerability for the seller, what's that? Well, let's go back to me as the exporter in the UK, and I've got a customer in India. So I ship the goods to India, I get all the documentation together, and I hand them to my bank in London. And I say to my bank in London, please collect payment from my customer in India. My bank in London sends the documents to their correspondent bank in India. The correspondent bank in India contacts my customer and says, please come and take up the documents. And my customer says to the bank, no, I won't. I don't want the documents. Now, if they don't get the documents, they won't be able to get the goods. So the buyer still has the goods, but they're on the way to India. They're going to have to get them back because the buyer has refused to take up the documents. So at least the goods are protected, but the seller, me in the UK, I'm going to have to find a new buyer for the goods in India or else bring the goods back to the UK. So that's one of the vulnerabilities from the seller's point of view. The buyer may refuse to take up the documents. But there's also a vulnerability from the buyer's point of view. So from the seller's point of view, a vulnerability, the buyer may not take up the documents. From the seller's point of view, let's look at the scenario again. I'm the seller in the UK. I ship the goods to my customer in India. I get the documents together. I present them to my bank in London. They send them to the bank in India. The bank in India contacts my customer. You're getting the gist of this now. My customer goes into the bank. They authorise their account to be debited. The bank in India releases the documents to the buyer in India. So the payment then goes from the bank in India to my bank in London into my account. So I've got the payment in my account. My customer in India has the documents. They go to their freight forwarder, give them the documents, and say to their freight forwarder, please customs clear the goods for me and take delivery. And the freight forwarder looks at them and says, really sorry, these documents do not fulfill the requirements of India Customs. They're not fit for purpose. I will not be able to clear the goods with these documents. Because with a bank collection, the banks are not responsible for checking any documents. All they're doing is exchanging a package of documents for payment. They have no responsibility to do any checks on the documents. And that's the vulnerability for the buyer. So with a bank collection, there's a vulnerability for the seller and a vulnerability for the buyer. From the seller's point of view, the buyer may refuse to take up the documents. From the buyer's point of view, they may take up the documents and authorise payment of the seller, but the documents may not be fit for purpose. So it's not a foolproof system, and you would only use a bank collection in a medium to low risk environment. Okay, let me pause there. Any questions so far? Okay, so we then have the bill of exchange, not widely used anymore, but still used. What's the definition of a bill of exchange? Well, there you go. This is the official definition. A bill of exchange is an unconditional order in writing addressed by one person to another, signed by the person giving it, requiring the person to whom it's addressed to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future time a sum certain in money to or to the order of a specified person or to the bearer, in other words, the holder of the bill of exchange. So that all sounds a little bit confusing. The best way to think about a bill of exchange, it's the opposite to a check. If I owe you money, I owe you $10. I can give you a check for $10. If you owe me $10, I can give you a bill of exchange for $10. And once you've signed that bill of exchange, you are accepting the fact that you owe me $10. If you don't give me that $10, I can take that bill of exchange to a judge in a court of law, and the judge will uphold the payment. So a bill of exchange is the complete opposite to a check. You use a check to give someone, if you owe someone some money, you give them a check to pay them. If you give them a bill of exchange, they owe you money. And once they've signed it, they've agreed legally that they have to pay you the money. If they don't pay you, a judge will uphold the payment when the bill of exchange is presented to a court of law. That's what a bill of exchange is. And if it's an averlised bill of exchange, that means the bill of exchange also has the guarantee of a bank. So that if the buyer doesn't honour the bill of exchange, then the averlising bank, the guaranteeing bank, will honour the bill of exchange. So, as I've mentioned, not used very much anymore, but they are still there. Sometimes for commodity trades, bills of exchange and averlised bills of exchange, those are the instruments that are used. So there we go. When we talk about methods of payment, we talk about the risk ladder. And it's a bit of a generalization, but there is an element of truth in saying that when we look at the payment methods, the best method of payment for the seller, in many ways, is the worst for the buyer. And the worst for the buyer is the best for the seller. You know, there's an element of truth in that. And you can see that on this graphic here. And, you know, what we actually have in the middle. So, for example, from the exporter's point of view, if we look at that, the highest risk is open account because they're trusting the buyer to pay them. They will have done their credit checks, country check, sovereign check, political check, commercial check. They've done all the checks and said, okay, we're going to go for open account. And the lowest risk is going to be advance payment, but advance payment is very, very high risk for the importer, for the buyer. But as you can see, in the middle, we have the documentary collection, the bank collection, and the letter of credit. We've spoken about the bank collection, and as I've mentioned, it's not foolproof. There's a vulnerability for the seller and a vulnerability for the buyer. It can go horribly wrong. But, you know, you would only use a documentary collection in a low to medium risk situation. And that leaves the documentary letter of credit. And as I've mentioned, we're going to look at that in some detail, because the letter of credit is the only payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. So before we look at the letter of credit, any questions so far? You know, we can take this slowly. It's really important.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Concerning especially cash against documents.
Yes.
Is that possible to give just to work on the copies by email or?
Well, very unlikely.
Digit copies.
I mean, you know, it depends how knowledgeable the buyer is. If I'm the buyer, I'm not going to pay you on copy documents, because the whole point is the documents represent the goods. But with the copies, I can't take delivery of the goods. So I'm not going to pay you just on copy documents. I want the originals, because I want to know that by paying you, I've then got documents by which I can customs clear and take delivery. So, you know, it's very, very unlikely that a buyer would accept cash against documents based on copy documents. If I was the buyer, I wouldn't, most certainly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good, but a good point. Thank you very much for asking.
If anyone has any other questions, please raise them. And if for some reason you can't speak, please type them in the chat and we'll raise them now.
Okay, I can't see anything. So, just before we talk about letters of credit, let's just have a very brief look at some other trade finance options that you've got. Now, most of or a lot of these aren't really used very much, but just for the sake of completeness, I think it's important to talk about some of them. And you may remember a few minutes ago I mentioned that there are ways that a seller can give credit to the buyer and get the money straight away. And that's called discounting. Sometimes it's called forfeiting. And that's basically getting a bank involved and saying to the bank, okay, I've got an invoice for €100,000. Payment to me is at 60 days. I need the money straight away. Will you discount the payment? And the bank may say, okay, we will discount, we will give you the money straight away, but you will only get €90,000. And that's what discounting is. It can be used with documentary collection, it can be used with letter of credit, it can be used where there's a bill of exchange. So the forfeiting organisation is generally going to be a bank. Of course, they'll charge for it. They're not going to discount or forfeit free of charge. There'll be a charge for that. And of course, you don't get, as a seller, you don't get the full invoice value. But it's a way of giving the customer credit, but getting payment straight away if you need to do that. So that's what discounting is. The old-fashioned expression was forfeiting. I think nowadays most people call it discounting. Then we have factoring, and that's when you sell your invoices as a seller. You sell your sales invoices to another company, they buy the invoices from you, and then they collect the payment from your customers. And of course, once again, you're not going to get the full invoice value, because the factoring company, they're taking on the risk, they're buying the risk from you, or you're selling the risk to them. So you're not going to get the full invoice value, but you're de-risking the situation. The factoring company pay you, and then they collect the payment from your customer. So not used that much, but it can be good if you're worried about getting payment. You don't want to use the other methods of payment to give, you know, to give secure payment and so on. We then have credit risk insurance, which I spoke about a few minutes ago, generally used with open account. From the seller's point of view, if you use open account, you're vulnerable. You're trusting the buyer to pay you. Now, as a seller, you're not going to allow open account until you've done stringent, they're going to be credit checks on your customer and all the country sovereign political risk checks as well. All the checks have to be done. But even so, once you've done the checks, things can still go wrong at the last minute. So very, very often, when you're trading under open account, you will get credit risk insurance. And credit risk insurance, as I mentioned earlier on, just like you can insure the risk of the goods getting broken or lost or stolen, you can also insure on the risk of not getting paid. And that's what credit risk insurance is. In many countries, credit risk insurance is run by a government agency. Here in the UK, we have UK Export Finance, UKEF, and they run credit risk insurance in the UK. But there's also a commercial market. Companies like Coface, what are they called, Nomura? There's quite a few of them. So there's a commercial market, but in some countries, it's run by government. So in the UK, there's a credit risk insurance agency, as I mentioned, UK Export Finance. In Zimbabwe, they have a government credit risk insurance facility. Many countries do. And in some countries, this tends to be mainly for capital projects, but some countries, they have government-supported buyer finance, where they help buyers finance capital projects. So, for example, in the UK wanted to get part of the project to build a new port in Nigeria. So the government in the UK, they provided finance for the ministry in Nigeria that are building the port. They gave them finance, but they had to get part of the project from UK suppliers. So government supported buyer finance means, the government is actually paying the exporter on behalf of the buyer. That's what government supported buyer finance is. I wouldn't say it's widely available, and it's generally only for big projects, big programs. However, I know, when I was working with the UK and putting together the critical minerals import policy, there's talk about that using government-supported buyer finance for critical minerals as well. It's not happening yet, or not as far as I know is it happening yet, but it could be something in the future. Export houses used to be very popular, very prevalent. Really, they're dying out now. There aren't so many of them. An export house is basically when you've got a manufacturer, a producer, a seller, a trader. They don't want to get in, they've got buyers in different countries, but they don't want to get involved in the export process. So they sell their product to export houses in their own country, and the export house takes on the actual export of the goods. So not so prevalent as they used to be, but they are, there's availability to a smaller extent. And then we have different kinds of letter of credit, which I'm going to come back to when we talk about letters of credit, back-to-back and transferable letters of credit. Those are financing tools as well. So what you can see there with the options, credit risk insurance is quite widely used, but the rest of them aren't really used that much. But the thing is, they're used to an extent, and they can be very, very good trade finance tools. So any questions on that before we start on letters of credit? Okay, so always good to start off with a definition. So what is a letter of credit? And we'll take this bit by bit. It's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank, in other words, the bank issuing the letter of credit, a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So as soon as the letter of credit is opened, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So just from that sentence, you've probably gathered that there's one risk that we've removed completely from the seller's point of view. As soon as the LC is opened, the letter of credit, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So can someone tell me what level of risk have we removed once the LC is opened?
Buyer's liquidity.
Yeah, we've removed, thank you very much, John. Absolutely. We've removed the commercial risk. The payment is no longer anything to do with the buyer. The payment is coming from the bank that opened the letter of credit. There is no more commercial risk. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. As soon as the LC is opened, I just, if I say LC, that's my abbreviation for letter of credit. As soon as the LC is opened, we have a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. There is no more commercial risk. The buyer cannot stop the payment. They can't. The payment will be made by the bank. But the payment is conditional. So, a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller, conditional upon presentation of documents to a nominated bank. So, the letter of credit will list a series of documents. And those documents have to be presented by the seller to a nominated bank in the seller's country. Okay, so the issuing bank, they're not just going to pay the seller's got to present documents listed in the letter of credit. They've got to present those documents to a nominated bank in the seller's country. And those documents, they're just not any old documents. They've got to be documents which strictly comply with all the terms and conditions, all the wording of the letter of credit. So put all of that together, a letter of credit, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller, conditional upon presentation of documents to a nominated bank in the seller's country, and the documents must strictly comply with all the terms and conditions stated within the letter of credit. That's the definition. So, any questions on that? Okay, we'll take this bit by bit by bit. Okay, so important thing to remember, the letter of credit is the only trade payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. Every attempt, and letters of credit have been used for, I'm not exaggerating when I say they've been used for centuries, at least 300 or 400 years. And it may seem a bit crazy in the current digital age, but the letter of credit, but no one's found a way of bettering the LC system. There have been attempts. I think about 10 years ago, the banks introduced something called the Bank Payment Obligation, the BPO. They thought that would be a good alternative to the letter of credit. I think it lasted about 5 years and it just wasn't effective. So they've stopped doing that. And now we've heard a lot about blockchain solutions. Some of the banks have been talking about that. They haven't actually implemented them. No bank has implemented a blockchain alternative. So currently, there is no other payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. And that's an important thing to remember. So it really is unique. Why is it unique? First of all, from the seller's perspective. From the seller's point of view, the seller has security of payment as long as the documents they present to the nominated bank are compliant with the letter of credit. So the seller has this guarantee of payment as long as the documents presented to the bank are correct and compliant and in strict conformance with the letter of credit. So that is the seller's security of payment. From the buyer's point of view, the buyer is assured that they will get the correct documentation to legally import the goods, and they will also get documentary proof that the terms of the sales contract have been performed by the seller. So, when you look at the concerns of the parties, the concern of the seller, am I going to get paid? The concern of the buyer hasn't seen the goods. The buyer has no knowledge that the seller will comply with the sales contract. And they want to know that the seller will comply with the sales contract before the seller gets paid. So from the buyer's point of view, that's their worry. The buyer wants evidence that the seller has presented documents by which they, the buyer, can legally import the goods into their country, and also documents to prove that the seller has performed the sales contract. If the seller has performed the sales contract and they have presented documents needed to import the goods, then the buyer would be happy for the seller to get paid. So by using the letter of credit, we're protecting both the seller and the buyer, and that's critical. So some of the myths from the exporter's point of view. Firstly, many exporters think, there's a rule that documents have to be strictly compliant with the letter of credit. And many exporters worry, if we make a spelling mistake in a document, we won't get paid. That's complete rubbish. A spelling mistake is not a discrepancy, and there are rules for letters of credit. We're going to look at the rules later on. A spelling mistake is not a discrepancy. And if there is a spelling mistake, the exporter will still get paid. That's a myth. Okay. There's another myth that the letter of credit only supports the seller, the exporter, by securing payment. That's a myth as well, because the letter of credit also protects the buyer, because the buyer, they list the documents the seller must present, and they will list documents to make sure they get the documents they need to legally import the goods, and documents by which the seller has to prove they've carried out the sales contract. So the letter of credit doesn't just support the exporter, it also supports the buyer, the importer. They're too complicated. That's interesting. I mean, it's very, very true. You do know how to, you have to know how to use them. You have to know the rules. But it really, again, takes me back to early in my career. And I can remember one of my early jobs, which I think I mentioned the other day, was with a manufacturing company. They made batteries. And I think I may have mentioned to you that in that company, when you started there as a graduate trainee, it was based in the UK, everyone started working with the department that dealt with exports to Ireland, Southern Ireland, because it was easy. It wasn't complicated. The documents were easy, the shipping was easy, everything was easy. So everyone started there, and then you went to another department. So after I did my time on the Ireland department, I think I mentioned last week, I went to the West Africa department, and my new boss said to me, John, anything you're worried about, now that you're with us, with the West Africa department. And I said to my boss, well, I know that we always get that, with all the exports to all the African countries, we always get paid by letter of credit. And I've heard that, and I said to him, I know nothing about them, but I've heard they're really complicated. And my boss said to me, actually, they're not complicated. They are the easiest way to export. He said to me, there's no guesswork. We get the letter of credit. It comes to us through the banking system, and it tells us exactly what we have to do with that consignment. There's no guesswork. It should be replicating the sales contract. And we look at it. We make sure we can do everything we're being asked to do. And it will tell us there's no guesswork. We don't have to worry, do we need to sign the invoices? The LC will tell us. If we have to sign them, it will call for signed invoices. We don't have to think, is a certificate of origin needed? The LC will tell us. It will ask for one, or it won't ask for one. So my boss said to me, it's the easiest way to export because everything we need to do is mentioned on that letter of credit. And he said, the great thing is, when you prepare the documentation, you just follow the requirement on the LC. You follow the wording on the LC onto the documents. That's what you do. And then we present those documents to a bank and we get paid. So even though it's true, you do need to know the rules. That's very important. And we're going to look at some of them later on. But the fact is, once you've got the letter of credit, it tells you exactly what you need to do. So many people, including me, would argue it is the easiest way to export. There's no guesswork. And at the end of the day, not only is it the easiest way to export, but you get paid at the end of it, as long as you get it right. And the other thing is they are always expensive. Well, of course, there will be bank charges. Of course, there will be. But you get what you pay for. What you pay for. As an exporter, you get security of payment. As an importer, as a buyer, there's no worry. You know you will get the documents you need to legally import the goods, and you know the seller won't get paid until they've proven by documents they've carried out the sales contract. So as a buyer, they're protected as well. And the cost of a letter of credit, I mean, when you're trading internationally, there's always going to be bank charges anyway, even if you're getting paid by bank transfer. Even if it's not even a documentary collection, there's always going to be charges. With a letter of credit, because the banks are taking risk, there will be more charge. Of course, there will be. And the charge will reflect the risk the bank is taking. So, of course, there will be bank charges, but the charges will be commensurate with the risk the bank is taking and the fact that you're getting a service from the bank. So I would argue they can be expensive. They're not always expensive, and they can provide, and very often do provide, very, very good value for money. So, it's not always the cost, is it? It's very, very often the value for money, what you're actually getting for that expense. And do bear in mind, as a seller or a buyer, that there's a market for opening and confirming letters of credit. So if you're a buyer, you don't have to use your own bank to open the LC. You can go to any bank that will do it for you. You can negotiate with them. Okay, my bank is charging me 1% or 0.5%. What will you charge me? Will you give me a better deal? So remember, bank charges are always negotiable. And the other thing to remember is that, of course, and I mentioned this earlier on, that which party pays the bank charges, that will be negotiated at the time of contracting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the standard position is that the seller will pay the bank charges in the country of export and the buyer will pay the bank charges in the country of import. So that in a letter of credit, the buyer will pay the opening charges and the seller will pay the advising bank's charges. But it doesn't have to be like that. It may be you've negotiated that the buyer pays all the charges or the seller pays all the charges. Again, that's subject to negotiation. So I just wanted to dispel some of those myths because they are myths. Okay, any questions, any comments so far? Okay, so when to use a letter of credit? When would you actually use one? And these are the kind of circumstances. I mean, you can use one whenever you want. That's really what it comes down to, because it does protect both parties. But these are the most likely situations when you would use an LC. Firstly, if the transaction, the payment risk is high. So if either the country risk or the commercial risk, either of those, or both of them for that matter, if either or both is high, that would be a good reason to use a letter of credit. If the risk is high, what are your options? They're payment in advance, but that leaves the buyer very, very vulnerable. In many countries, they're not allowed to pay in advance. So in that case, a much better option, if the risk is high, is to use a letter of credit. In some countries, it's a requirement. In some importing countries, because they want to control foreign exchange, actually using a letter of credit as a method of payment is compulsory. For example, in Nigeria, if you sell to Nigeria, the Central Bank of Nigeria will only authorize foreign exchange if it's done under bank collection or letter of credit. They won't authorize open account or payment in advance. They won't do that. It's a federal rule in Nigeria under federal law. Payment has to be by letter of credit or by bank collection. So sometimes it may be a requirement in the country of importation, and that's very, very often the case where, there are exchange control restrictions in the emerging markets. In general, even if the risks appear to be low, the seller may still be concerned about receiving payment in full and on time. They may think, actually, the buyer's been a bit tricky. We've got a contract with them, but we think they're going to try and find reasons when payment time comes to not pay us in full or not pay us on time. So if there's any concern about that, the credit controller may say, well, it's a kind of borderline situation with this customer. Even though the country political sovereign risk is low, and that customer, they had paid us on time in the past, we're just, the credit controller may say, I'm just getting a little bit of a feeling about that customer. They're querying a few things. I'm just getting a little bit worried they may not pay us in full, or they may not pay us on time. That would be a good reason to use a letter of credit. Or it may be the buyer's decision. The buyer may be worried, will the seller perform the sales contract? For example, will the seller provide documents which the buyer needs to get the goods? Will the goods be the right quality or quantity? In the letter of credit, for example, the buyer may put in a clause asking for pre-shipment inspection by someone like our friends from Intertek or another inspection company. And there can be other things as well. There can be a lot of things. Maybe the sales contract says the goods are of EU origin. Okay, that could be a key thing. But the buyer is worried, are they really EU origin? Well, they can put a clause in the letter of credit. Goods to be of EU origin, certificate of origin to this effect is required, and then they're getting proof of that. So very often it's going to be the buyer who insists on it. The buyer may be concerned about the seller's capacity or their intention to perform the sales contract. In that case, the buyer can control the situation by opening a carefully opened letter of credit, making sure that they ask for the correct documentation. And sometimes it can be used to support export finance. Because the reality is that if you're a seller, once you've got that letter of credit, you've got a conditional guarantee of payment. And with that conditional guarantee of payment, you can actually go to a bank and say, look, here is collateral. I've got a letter of credit of 500,000 euros from my customer in Saudi Arabia. I've got that LC. Okay, please give me a loan using that as collateral. I need a loan to buy some product from Zambia to sell to Saudi Arabia. Give me a loan using that letter of credit as collateral. So supporting export finance, and a letter of credit is considered to be collateral when you're negotiating, trying to get export finance. So there's a whole bundle of scenarios there where using a letter of credit would be the right thing to do. And very, very often, it's going to be, in many cases, buyer and seller, both of them are going to be really happy with that. Not always, but, very, very often that will be the case. Both parties will be really happy with that. But sometimes you get pushback. A buyer may say, no, I don't want to open a letter of credit. A seller would have to think, well, I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because the bank was saying, we're not going to open it. If the buyer goes to a bank and asks for a letter of credit, the bank will not open it before they've checked the commercial risk of the buyer. Okay, so if a buyer says, I can't open an LC, that could tell you the buyer is not creditworthy. Or it could be, very likely, and this happens quite a lot, the buyer just doesn't know how to go through the process. I find myself training a lot of importers on how to open a letter of credit, what to ask for when you open an LC. So it could be lack of knowledge, but it also could be because the buyer is not creditworthy and the bank have said, no, we're not going to open a letter of credit for you because you're not creditworthy. That could be the reason. So it can be a little bit of a warning sign if a buyer ever says to you, we're not going to open an LC because we don't want to, then your next question should be, why not? What is stopping you? It could be their creditworthiness. But sometimes from the seller's point of view, the buyer may say, OK, we'll pay you by opening a letter of credit. And the buyer may say, yeah, I'm not sure we really want to do that. We're not very good at getting the documents together. We're not very good at generating correct documents. Well, immediately from the buyer's perspective, if I'm the buyer, I would say, well, that's exactly why we want to open an LC, to make sure you do generate correct documentation. But I think also, there really is a lot of folklore. As I've mentioned, there are these myths. There's a lot of folklore about letters of credit. I hear it a lot from exporters. We don't want to open an LC. If we make a spelling mistake, we won't get paid. If we put a full stop in the wrong place, we put a comma in the wrong place, we won't get paid. We don't know how to present compliant documents. But actually, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is copy the wording from the LC onto the documents. But those are the things that we hear over and over again. And realistically, you can't get over the fact that an LC is still the only payment method that protects both seller and buyer. OK, that's all there is to it. Protects both the seller and the buyer. But there's got to be rules to LCs. And we have a set of rules for LCs. And we'll talk about that later on. So a good point to pause here, I think. So let's pause here. Just before we pause, are there any questions so far? Okay, so we'll pause now for the break. Then after the break, we'll look at how does an LC work. We'll look at the procedure flow for how the letter of credit works. We'll look at the different types of LCs because, as traders, you may want to use things like back-to-back letters of credit or transferable letters of credit, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So we'll talk about the different kinds available, and then we'll have a brief look at the rules governing LCs. In the time available, we can't go through the whole thing, but we'll have a brief look at the rules so that you can get a taster for the rules governing letters of credit. So let's break now. It's just about coming up to 2:30 UK time. If we could please reconvene in 30 minutes at 3 o'clock UK time, which will be UTC +1. OK, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, John. We'll see you at 3 o'clock.
See you at 3 o'clock.